The hum of the airport was steady and unchanging. A background chorus of distant announcements, rolling suitcases, and murmured conversations. Gate 12A was no different, a mix of weary travelers and eager vacationers waiting to board the afternoon flight. Among them, Professor Elias Carter stood quietly. A man in his 70s with a presence that was as unassuming as it was dignified. His suit was neatly pressed, his gray hair trimmed short, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses rested comfortably on his face. To anyone passing by, he might have been just another traveler, blending seamlessly into the crowd. The boarding call came at last. A polite but impersonal tone announcing the start of priority seating. Elias adjusted the leather strap of his carry-on bag over his shoulder and stepped into line. His movements were deliberate, measured, not slow, but the careful pace of someone who had learned the value of patience over decades of life. When he reached the narrow aisle of the plane, the space felt even more confined than usual. Passengers jostled for overhead space, their movements hurried and competitive. Elias paused near his assigned seat, his carry-on still slung over his shoulder. The overhead compartment was just out of reach. "Excuse me," he said softly, addressing a nearby flight attendant who was straightening a blanket on one of the seats. "Would you mind helping me with this?" The woman, her name tag read, Jane Rogers, glanced up briefly. Her expression neutral. She wasn't young, perhaps in her early 40s, with a sharp efficiency in her movements. Jane didn't seem annoyed, but neither did she seem particularly interested. She straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and shook her head. "That's not my responsibility," she replied matter-of-factly, already turning her attention back to her task. "You'll need to ask another passenger." For a moment, Elias stood there, his hand still on the strap of his bag. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. He didn't argue or insist. Instead, he shifted slightly to the side, his posture as calm and composed as ever, and began looking around for help. The interaction passed unnoticed by most, except for one man a few rows back. Michael Lawson, a middle-aged software consultant traveling for work, had been idly scrolling through his phone when the exchange caught his attention. He saw Elias glance toward the other passengers, then back at the overhead bin, his fingers tightening slightly on the strap of his bag. Michael hesitated. It wasn't his problem, he told himself. Someone else would step in. But as the seconds stretched on and no one moved, a quiet unease settled over him. He rose from his seat, tucking his phone into his pocket, and made his way forward. "Here, let me help you with that," Michael said, reaching for the bag. He offered Elias a small smile, and the older man nodded in gratitude, stepping aside to allow him to lift the carry-on into the compartment. "Thank you," Elias said simply. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that Michael couldn't quite place, something that lingered long after the bag was stowed and Elias had taken his seat. Michael returned to his own row, his thoughts still on the brief exchange. The flight attendant hadn't been overtly rude, he reasoned, and yet, there had been something unmistakably dismissive in her tone. As if she had decided, in an instant, that helping Elias wasn't worth her time. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this small act, this refusal, carried more weight than Jane likely realized. As the plane filled and the aisle grew crowded, the moment passed, swallowed by the noise and commotion of boarding. But for Michael, and perhaps for Elias too, it left an imprint, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniably there, a reminder that sometimes, the smallest interactions speak the loudest truths. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed into the clouds, a low vibration that seemed to settle into the background of the journey. Passengers shifted in their seats, opening magazines, adjusting neck pillows, or closing their eyes against the soft overhead lights. For many, the flight was just another ordinary stretch of time, a place to endure rather than experience. Michael Lawson, seated in row 16, wasn't so lucky. He couldn't seem to shake the image of the older man, the quiet request for help, the dismissive response, and the way Elias Carter had handled it all with such measured grace. Michael shifted in his seat, glancing forward to where the professor now sat, the top of his gray head barely visible above the seatback. It wasn't as if the flight attendant had done anything overtly wrong. Michael reasoned. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. She'd simply refused a refusal that, on its surface, seemed benign. Yet the more Michael thought about it, the more it nagged at him. There had been something in her tone, in the subtle tilt of her head, that felt like dismissal, not just of the request, but of the man himself. Michael leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't know much about Elias, hadn't even caught the man's name yet, but something about him stood out. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a sense of someone who had lived long enough to know when to choose his battles. It was that dignity, Michael realized, that had made the refusal so unsettling. It wasn't just the act, it was the fact that Elias had expected it. As if this kind of treatment was simply another fact of life. As unremarkable as the weather. The woman sitting next to Michael, a young mother traveling with her infant daughter, shifted uncomfortably as the baby began to fuss. Michael glanced at her, offering a polite smile, but his thoughts quickly drifted back. He wondered how often Elias had faced moments like these, and how often he had chosen to let them pass without comment. A flight attendant rolled a beverage cart down the aisle, her cheery voice breaking the quiet murmur of the cabin. It wasn't Jane, but her presence reminded Michael of the earlier exchange. He turned his attention back to the professor. Elias had settled into his seat, a book open on his lap. Michael couldn't make out the title, but he could see the man's expression, calm, focused, and entirely unbothered by the world around him. Or so it seemed. It wasn't until the beverage cart reached Elias's row that the quiet tension of the flight began to shift. Jane was serving drinks now, her tone still clipped and efficient, though there was a noticeable change in her demeanor. She seemed uneasy, her movements slightly hurried as she handed cups of water and soda to passengers. When she reached Elias, she paused for just a moment, her gaze flicking to the book in his lap. "Anything to drink?" she asked, her voice neutral but edged with something else, something uncertain. Elias looked up, meeting her gaze briefly before shaking his head. "No, thank you," he said, his tone polite, almost dismissive. Jane moved on quickly, but Michael caught the faintest hint of discomfort in her expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Michael watched the interaction closely, feeling a flicker of satisfaction he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't revenge, nothing so dramatic. It was something quieter, a sense that perhaps, for the first time, Jane was beginning to sense the weight of her earlier actions. As the cart moved past, Michael found himself wanting to know more about Elias. Not out of pity or even curiosity, but out of respect. There was a story behind the man's quiet dignity. Michael was certain of it. And somehow, he felt that story mattered not just to Elias, but to everyone on that flight, even if they didn't realize it yet. For now, though, Michael stayed in his seat, watching the clouds roll by outside the window. He told himself it was just a flight, just a moment in time. But deep down, he knew better. Some moments were small but carried a weight that lingered. Long after the seatbelt sign had been turned off, the cabin had settled into a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the occasional murmur of conversation or the rustle of newspapers. Outside, the plane soared through a sea of clouds, the afternoon sun casting soft shadows across the rows of seats. Michael Lawson stared absently at the in-flight magazine in his hands, the glossy pages untouched. His thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to the brief but telling interaction he'd witnessed earlier. It wasn't the kind of event most people would remember. A simple refusal, a moment of disregard, and yet, for Michael, it stuck. It wasn't the action itself so much as the larger story. It hinted at a story that felt all too familiar, even if it wasn't his own. Unable to shake his curiosity, Michael glanced toward the professor again. The older man was still reading, his posture relaxed but not slouched, his hands steady on the book's edges. There was something almost meditative about the way he read, as though he were somewhere else entirely, far removed from the cramped cabin and its invisible tensions. Michael hesitated, then unbuckled his seatbelt. He wasn't sure what he would say, or if the man would even want to talk. But something about Elias's quiet presence felt like an invitation, not obvious or explicit. But they're all the same. Michael made his way down the aisle, stopping a few rows ahead. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low so as not to disturb the other passengers. "Do you mind if I sit here for a bit?" Elias looked up, his expression calm but curious. He nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "Not at all," he said, his voice as steady as his demeanor. Michael settled into the seat, taking a moment to adjust before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, "for letting me help you earlier. I mean, I know you didn't really need me to step in, but..." Elias smiled faintly, closing his book and resting it on his lap. "It's I who should thank you," he said. "It's not often someone takes the time to notice, let alone act." The simplicity of the statement caught Michael off guard. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that both men seemed to understand without needing to spell it out. "I'm Michael," he said after a moment, extending his hand. "Elias Carter," the professor replied, his grip firm despite his age. There was strength in that handshake, a reminder of a life lived with purpose. They talked quietly, their voices blending into the hum of the plane. Michael learned that Elias had spent decades as an educator, teaching history at a university in the Midwest. He spoke of his work with a kind of understated pride, emphasizing not his own achievements but the success of his students. "It's always been about them," Elias said. "Teaching isn't about making yourself feel important. It's about giving others the tools to find their own path." Michael listened, struck by the man's humility. He found himself asking questions not just to keep the conversation going, but because he genuinely wanted to know more. Elias, in turn, seemed happy to oblige, sharing anecdotes that were as insightful as they were unassuming. At one point, Michael asked about the book Elias had been reading. The professor held it up briefly, revealing the title, The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. "It's an old favorite," Elias said. "Every time I read it, I find something new, something I missed before." Michael nodded, sensing that the choice of book was no coincidence. There was a subtle but deliberate weight to everything Elias said and did, as though every action carried a deeper meaning. As the conversation continued, Michael began to notice something else, a quiet but undeniable shift in the cabin. Other passengers were glancing toward Elias now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet recognition. It wasn't clear if they'd overheard the conversation or if they simply sensed something in the professor's presence. Either way, it was as if the atmosphere of the flight had subtly changed, becoming more thoughtful, more introspective. By the time Michael returned to his own seat, he felt lighter somehow, as though the act of talking to Elias had given him a new perspective. He glanced back once, watching as the professor reopened his book, his focus undisturbed. Michael settled into his seat and closed his eyes, letting the steady hum of the plane lull him into thought. He hadn't expected much from this flight, just a few hours of discomfort followed by the rush of disembarking. But now, he found himself wondering if some journeys mattered not because of where they began or ended, but because of who you met along the way. The flight carried on, the plane cutting a steady path through the sky. The cabin was quiet now, filled with the soft hum of engines and the occasional shuffle of passengers stretching or adjusting their seats. Elias Carter sat where Michael had left him, his book resting lightly in his hands. To the casual observer, he was just another traveler passing the time. But there was something about him, his calm, deliberate manner, that had begun to draw attention. A young woman across the aisle whispered something to her companion, her eyes flicking toward Elias. Further down, an older man leaned closer to his wife, speaking in a voice just low enough to be inaudible. Word was spreading, though no one could say exactly how it had started. Perhaps someone had recognized the professor, or perhaps the quiet dignity with which he carried himself had sparked curiosity. Whatever the cause, the mood of the cabin was shifting, like ripples spreading across still water. Michael Lawson, back in his seat, noticed it too. He could feel it in the way people glanced toward Elias, their expressions thoughtful, even cautious. It wasn't quite admiration, not yet, but it was something close. A growing awareness that this quiet, unassuming man might not be as ordinary as he seemed. It was Jane Rogers, the flight attendant, who seemed most affected by the change. She moved through the cabin with her usual efficiency, her posture stiff and professional, But there was a subtle tension in her movements now. Her eyes flicked toward Elias more often than she might have intended. And there was a faint but unmistakable unease in her expression. Jane paused near Elias's row, pretending to adjust a tray in the overhead bin. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if considering whether to speak. But then she moved on, her steps brisk and her gaze averted. Michael watched her retreat, a faint sense of satisfaction stirring in him. He hadn't spoken to Jane directly, hadn't felt the need to, but he could see that the moment from earlier had not been forgotten. As the plane began its slow descent toward cruising altitude, a middle-aged woman in the row behind Elias leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tentative. Elias turned, his expression polite but curious. "I just wanted to say," the woman continued, "I think I recognize you. Are you Professor Carter?" Elias nodded slightly, his smile faint but genuine. "I am," he said. The woman's face lit up, a mixture of surprise and delight. "I thought so. I read one of your articles a few years ago. It was about the Reconstruction era. Wasn't it? It was brilliant." Elias inclined his head in gratitude. "Thank you. I'm glad you found it meaningful." Their conversation was quiet, but it was enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Heads turned, and whispers began to spread. The recognition was gradual at first, but it grew steadily, like a tide rising imperceptibly until it was impossible to ignore. Michael watched as passengers began to piece it together. He saw the way their gazes lingered on Elias now, their expressions shifting from indifference to curiosity, and in some cases, respect. It wasn't long before a soft murmur filled the cabin, the collective realization rippling outward. Elias, for his part, seemed unaffected. He remained composed, answering questions politely when addressed but otherwise returning to his book. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no need to assert his importance. It was as if he understood that his presence alone was enough. Jane reappeared near Elias's row, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hesitated again, then finally approached him. "Professor Carter," she said, her voice quieter than before. I didn't realize who you were earlier. I'm sorry if I came across as dismissive." Elias looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, and then he spoke. "It's quite all right," he said. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but there was a weight to his words that seemed to hang in the air. "We all have moments we wish we'd handled differently." Jane nodded, her face slightly flushed. She seemed unsure of what to say next. And after a moment, she retreated. The passengers watched this exchange in silence. Their reactions varied. Some looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable, and still others seemed to reflect on their own actions or inactions earlier in the flight. Michael felt a quiet sense of vindication. Not for himself, but for Elias. It wasn't a triumph in the usual sense, but it felt significant nonetheless. A small moment, perhaps, but one that mattered. As the flight continued, the atmosphere remained subdued but thoughtful. It was as though the entire cabin had been reminded of something they'd always known but rarely acknowledged, that respect and dignity were not things to be earned through titles or recognition, but things that should be extended to everyone. Without question, Elias returned to his book, his expression as calm as ever. If he noticed the shift around him, he didn't show it, but Michael suspected that he had, because Elias Carter, it seemed, was the kind of man who noticed everything. The sun had begun its descent, casting long golden rays through the cabin windows. Passengers stirred in their seats, some stretching their legs, others settling back into quiet conversations or thumbing through books and magazines. The hum of the plane remained steady, a backdrop to the subtle shifts in the air, a quiet tension mixed with something unspoken yet shared. Elias Carter sat where he had been all flight, his book closed now, resting on the tray table in front of him. He gazed out of the window, his expression serene but reflective. To the untrained eye, he looked like any other passenger, passing the time as the plane carried him to his destination. But for those who had watched the events unfold earlier, Elias had become more than just a fellow traveler. He had become a quiet symbol of something larger, an unspoken challenge to assumptions, a living contradiction to prejudice. Michael Lawson noticed it, too, from his seat. He observed the way passengers glanced at Elias. Their expressions thoughtful, even hesitant. It wasn't pity, Michael realized, nor was it simple curiosity. It was something deeper, a recognition of the quiet dignity Elias carried with him. Even in the face of subtle, everyday dismissals, the murmurs started near the front of the cabin. Faint at first but growing louder as they spread. A passenger, a man in his 40s wearing a blazer, stood and turned toward Elias. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice polite but firm enough to carry across the nearby rows. "Are you Professor Elias Carter, the historian?" Elias turned his gaze to the man and nodded slightly. "I am." The man's face lit up with recognition. "I can't believe it. I read your book on Reconstruction. It was transformative. I teach at a small college. And your work is required reading in my class. Your insights, they change the way I think about that period of history." Elias inclined his head, his smile faint but genuine. "I'm glad my work has been of use to you." The exchange drew the attention of more passengers. A woman in the adjacent row leaned forward. Her curiosity piqued. "Reconstruction?" she asked. "You mean post-Civil War history?" "Yes," the man replied, his excitement evident. "Professor Carter's work is groundbreaking. He doesn't just focus on the broad strokes. He highlights the individual stories, the voices of people history so often forgets." "It's extraordinary." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's remarkable. I had no idea we were in the presence of someone so accomplished." Elias shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. But before he could speak, another passenger joined the conversation. "I've heard of you, too," a younger man said, his voice tentative. "You gave a lecture at my university a few years ago. I wasn't even a history major. But I still remember it. You made it feel personal." Elias's expression softened. "History is personal," he said simply. "It's the story of all of us, shaped by choices made and chances taken. It's not just something that happened, it's something that's still happening." The cabin grew quieter as passengers leaned in, their curiosity now fully engaged. Even Jane Rogers, the flight attendant, stood a few rows back, her expression unreadable. She seemed torn between her professional role and the very human urge to listen. Michael watched it all unfold, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. This was what he had sensed earlier, the presence of something greater than the moment itself. Elias wasn't just a man with a storied career. He was a reminder of how much weight small interactions could carry. A reminder that history wasn't just written in books but lived, day by day, in the choices people made and the values they upheld. As the impromptu discussion continued, Michael noticed something shift in the passengers around him. The initial awkwardness, the subtle discomfort, began to fade, replaced by a sense of collective respect. People weren't just listening, they were learning. Not from a lecture but from the quiet presence of a man who had spent his life giving voice to the overlooked. Jane finally stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Professor Carter," she began, her voice softer than before. "I'd like to personally thank you for everything you've done for history. For education. I didn't realize earlier who you were. And for that, I'm truly sorry." Elias looked up at her, his gaze steady. "There's no need for apologies," he said, "but perhaps a reminder. We all have a responsibility to see people, not just for who they are, but for who they might be. That requires a certain kind of vision, one I hope we all strive to develop." Jane nodded, her face flushed but sincere. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. The exchange left the cabin in reflective silence, the weight of Elias's words lingering long after the conversation had ended. Michael leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. This flight, he realized, wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was a journey in every sense of the word, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments could carry extraordinary meaning. Elias Carter returned to his book, the quiet hum of the plane once again enveloping the cabin. But this time, the silence felt different, less like absence and more like presence. As though everyone aboard was quietly rethinking what they had seen, what they had heard, and, perhaps, what they might carry forward. The plane continued its journey, cruising through the late afternoon sky with a quiet steadiness. The mood in the cabin had shifted. though few would have been able to pinpoint exactly when it happened. The passengers were quieter now, their movements more subdued, as though they had collectively decided to take stock of the moment they were sharing. Conversations were hushed, thoughtful, and there was an undeniable air of reflection. Elias Carter, as always, remained a picture of calm. His book lay unopened on his tray table, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He gazed out the window, the sunlight glinting off his glasses, his expression serene yet contemplative. He seemed unaware or perhaps simply unbothered by the attention still lingering around him. Michael Lawson, sitting a few rows back, couldn't help but marvel at the professor's poise. There was no arrogance in Elias's demeanor, no sense of entitlement. Instead, there was a quiet assurance, a kind of inner strength that needed no acknowledgement to exist. Michael found himself wondering how many people Elias had influenced in his lifetime, how many minds he had changed. Not through grand gestures, but through his steadfast commitment to truth and understanding. As the plane began its gradual descent, Jane Rogers approached Elias's row once again. Her posture was less rigid now, her expression softer, though there was still a hint of nervousness in the way she clasped her hands. She paused beside Elias's seat, clearing her throat gently to announce her presence. "Professor Carter," she began, her voice quieter than before. "I wanted to thank you for your words earlier. They gave me a lot to think about." Elias turned to her, his expression kind but measured. "I'm glad they resonated with you," he said simply. Jane hesitated, then continued, her words carefully chosen. "I realize now that I made a mistake earlier. When you asked for help, I didn't take the time to see you as a person. I didn't think about how my response might make you feel." Elias regarded her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "It takes courage to reflect on our actions," he said finally, "and even more courage to admit when we've fallen short. What matters most is what we choose to do next." Jane nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'll do better," she said, almost to herself. The exchange was brief, but it carried a weight that reverberated through the cabin. Nearby passengers listened in silence, their faces thoughtful, as though they were considering their own roles in the countless small moments that made up their lives. As Jane walked away, Elias turned back to the window, his expression unchanged. He had said his piece, and that was enough. For him, the moment was over, but for those around him, it felt like something larger, a reminder that the simplest interactions could carry the heaviest burdens. And that change often began not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate choices. Michael watched all of this unfold, a quiet admiration growing in him. He thought about the countless ways Elias must have faced moments like these throughout his life. The subtle dismissals, the quiet indignities, the moments of invisibility, and yet, here he was calm, composed, and unwilling to let the weight of those experiences dictate his character. It was a kind of strength Michael wasn't sure he possessed, but he aspired to nonetheless. As the plane began its final descent, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the cabin in a warm, golden light. The passengers prepared for landing, their movements deliberate, their expressions contemplative. There was no chatter, no rush to gather belongings. Instead, there was a sense of shared understanding, as though everyone aboard had been reminded of something they had long forgotten, that kindness and respect were not luxuries, but necessities. When the plane touched down, the cabin filled with the usual flurry of activity. Overhead bins were opened, bags retrieved, and passengers filed into the aisle, ready to disembark. But as Elias rose from his seat, something unexpected happened. One by one, the passengers around him paused, offering small nods or words of thanks as he passed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just quiet gestures of acknowledgement, but they carried a significance that words could not. Michael lingered behind, watching as Elias made his way toward the exit. He didn't try to catch up or say goodbye. He didn't need to. Instead, he carried the moment with him, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. This flight had been more than a journey, it had been a lesson. A reminder that dignity was not something given or taken, but something earned and defended, one small moment at a time. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the mood was noticeably subdued. Gone was the usual rush of impatience and chatter. In its place was a quiet that felt reflective, almost reverent. Elias Carter walked calmly toward the terminal, his leather bag resting lightly over one shoulder. His steps were steady, unhurried, as though he were in no rush to leave this moment behind. Michael Lawson followed a few steps behind, watching the small interactions unfold around the professor. A man in a business suit paused to thank Elias for his contributions to history, his voice tinged with humility. A young woman hesitated before offering a quiet, "I've learned a lot today. Thank you." Even the gate agent at the door, who had been brisk and impersonal during boarding, seemed to soften as Elias approached, nodding respectfully as she wished him a good day. The terminal itself was bustling, filled with the usual cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried footsteps. But for those who had shared the flight, there was a lingering connection, a sense that they had experienced something that wouldn't be left behind at baggage claim. Michael caught up to Elias just as they reached the main concourse. "Professor Carter," he said, his voice cutting gently through the noise. Elias turned, his expression warm but unreadable. "I just wanted to say, thank you, for everything. I don't know if you realize how much of an impact you've had today." Elias tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Impact," he repeated softly. "It's a curious thing. We rarely know the full measure of it, do we?" Michael nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "I suppose not. But today, you made a difference. For me, at least." The professor regarded him for a moment, his gaze steady. "Sometimes," he said, "it's enough to plant a seed. It's not about seeing it grow, it's about trusting that it will." Michael fell silent, unsure how to respond. But before he could find the words, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me." They turned to see Jane Rogers, the flight attendant, standing a few feet away. Her uniform was neat, her posture as composed as ever. But there was a vulnerability in her expression that hadn't been there before. She held her hands clasped in front of her, as though grounding herself for what she was about to say. "Professor Carter," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I know I've apologized already. But I wanted to say it again. Not just for how I treated you, but for what it represented. I've been thinking a lot about how I see people, about how quick I was to make assumptions. And I want to do better." Elias studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step," he said gently. "The next is acting on it. We're all capable of change, Jane. The question is whether we choose it." Jane exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I won't forget this." As she walked away, Michael turned back to Elias, his admiration for the man growing with each passing moment. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Stay so calm, so gracious, even when people don't deserve it." Elias smiled faintly, his eyes distant for a moment. "I've learned," he said, "that anger often burns the one who carries it more than the one it's directed at. That doesn't mean we should ignore injustice. But how we respond, that's where our power lies." Michael nodded, letting the words settle. They stood there for a moment longer, surrounded by the ebb and flow of travelers, before Elias adjusted the strap of his bag and offered Michael a final nod. "Take care of yourself," Elias said, "and don't underestimate the impact of the small things." With that, the professor turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Michael watched him go, a sense of quiet resolve taking root in his chest. This wasn't just another day or another flight. It was a reminder, subtle yet profound, that change often began with the smallest of actions, the quietest of moments. As Michael made his way toward the exit, he found himself reflecting not just on Elias, but on his own life. On the times he had remained silent when he should have spoken up. On the moments he had overlooked when he should have paid attention. It wasn't about guilt, he realized. It was about opportunity. The opportunity to see, to listen, to act. In the end, he thought, perhaps Elias was right. It wasn't about the impact you could measure. It was about the seeds you planted, and the faith that someday, somehow, they would grow. The airport terminal stretched out in every direction, a sea of movement and sound, Families reunited with hugs and laughter. Business travelers strode purposefully toward taxis. And weary passengers searched for signs pointing them to baggage claim. In the middle of it all, Elias Carter walked with the same calm that had carried him through the flight. He was alone, yet there was a presence about him that seemed to part the crowd, drawing subtle glances of curiosity and respect. Michael Lawson lingered near the exit, his thoughts still heavy with the events of the day. He watched as Elias stopped briefly at a newsstand, scanning the headlines with an unhurried air. The professor didn't seem aware of the impact he had left on the passengers who had shared the flight with him. Or perhaps he was, and simply chose not to dwell on it. Either way, his quiet dignity remained unshaken. As Michael prepared to leave, he noticed a small group of passengers from their flight gathered nearby. They weren't speaking to one another, but their shared glances and reflective expressions hinted that the experience had left an impression. Among them was Jane Rogers, standing off to the side, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. She seemed lost in thought, her usual briskness replaced by a subdued stillness. Michael approached her, unsure of what he wanted to say but feeling compelled to connect. "Jane," he said gently, drawing her attention. She turned to him, her expression softening. "Oh, Michael," she replied, her voice quieter than it had been on the plane. "I didn't expect to see you here. I just wanted to say," Michael began, hesitating for a moment. "What you said to Professor Carter back there, it meant something. To him, and to everyone else who saw it." Jane nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the terminal floor. "I've been in this job for over 20 years, she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I thought I'd seen it all, dealt with every kind of passenger. But today reminded me how much I still have to learn." Michael offered a small, understanding smile. "It's not easy to face those moments. But you did. That counts for something." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "You think it's enough?" "It's a start," Michael said simply. "And sometimes, that's all we can ask for." They stood in silence for a moment, the bustling terminal fading into the background. Then Jane straightened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for saying that." As she turned and walked away, Michael felt a quiet sense of closure. He wasn't sure what would come of Jane's reflection, whether her apology would translate into change, but he knew the moment mattered. For her, for Elias, and for everyone who had borne witness. Michael's gaze drifted back to the professor, who was now making his way toward the exit. He moved with the same unhurried grace, his presence as steady and unshakable as ever. Michael wanted to follow, to offer some final words of gratitude. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Elias didn't need validation or praise. He carried his dignity with him, not as a shield, but as a quiet affirmation of who he was. Instead, Michael turned toward his own path, weaving through the crowd with a newfound sense of purpose. The flight had ended, but the lessons it carried lingered. In the smallest moments, the unspoken glances, the simple exchanges, there had been a quiet reckoning, a reminder of the humanity that connected them all. For Elias, the journey continued. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, he paused briefly, looking up at the sky. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like distant stars. And he took a deep breath. There was work to be done, there always was, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Behind him, the terminal pulsed with life, its stories unfolding in 1,000 different directions. And somewhere among them, the seeds of change were taking root. Small and quiet, but unmistakably there.